So the basal ganglia. This is motor pathways that are involved in modulating muscle movement. And the basal ganglia has a direct pathway as well as an indirect pathway. They're pretty similar, except for in the direct pathway, you go from the striatum directly to the globus pallidus interna, while in the indirect pathway you have to go through the globus pallidus externa first, and then through the subthalamic nucleus, and then finally to globus pallidus interna. Now we're going to focus on the globus pallidus interna for a sec. There's a lot of moving parts in these pathways, so we're going to use this as our it's going to be our anchor point. And the function of this in the big picture is that it basically blocks muscle movement, it prevents muscle movement. And you see how this works because the globus pallidus interna has inhibitory effect on the thalamus, and the thalamus has an excitatory effect on the motor cortex. So basically, globus pallidus interna is inhibiting the motor cortex activation. Okay, so this is going to be our anchor point. It makes everything really easy. And then also the other thing to note is the subthalamic nucleus promotes the globus pallidus interna work. So I think of them almost as one unit here, okay? They're one unit that is blocking muscle movement. Alright, so without further ado, let's look at the direct pathway first. Direct pathway is striatum directly to the globus pallidus interna, and it's going to send inhibitory signals there. So you're going to take out the blocker of muscle movement. You're moving that, so you're actually going to be promoting muscle movement, okay? So the direct pathway promotes movement, and that's why I've done the direct pathway in green, just to emphasize that it's promoting movement. Now let's take a look at the we're going to look at the indirect pathway now. The indirect pathway, as we said, it takes a long roundabout way. Striatum is going to block the globus pallidus interna, and the globus pallidus interna blocks the subthalamic nucleus. Now we see that we have a double negative here, so we're canceling each other out. So we're actually activating this whole block of stuff, and we're leading to more blockage of muscle movement. So the indirect pathway blocks muscle movement. Okay, it does that through the double negative effect, which leads to the globus pallidus interna just being still present, still working, and then so you have blocked muscle movement. Now that's not the end of the story here. I've actually left something out, which is the substantia nigra pars compacta. That's right here. And this is an area of the brain. I'm just going to SNC, that's substantia nigra pars compacta. This area of the brain is responsible for secreting dopamine. Okay. This dopamine will go to the striatum, and in the direct pathway, dopamine, there are D1 receptors that lead to have an excitatory effect on the striatum. So D1 will activate the direct pathway, leading to even more muscle movement. So that's good. On the indirect pathway, it's still dopamine, but there's D2 receptors now. So dopamine on the D2 receptors has an inhibitory effect. So D2 receptors lead to it blocks the indirect pathway. So you actually block the inhibition. So you actually end up leading to a D2. Also promotes muscle movement. Okay, and it does this through inhibition of the indirect pathway. And I just want to sum up that D1 also promotes muscle movement through the activation of the direct pathway. So both dopamine promotes muscle movement through both pathways. Promotes. So you do need to know every part of this, all these pathways. It's much more simple, I think, if you just consider the globus pallidus interna and the subthalamic nucleus as one block. And just remember that use the globus pallidus interna as your anchor point, and just remember that its function is to block muscle movement. So the direct pathway goes directly and takes out this globus pallidus interna, so you're actually promoting movement. And then the indirect pathway goes a roundabout way, and so you get a double negative that cancels each other out. So your globus pallidus interna is still there, still blocking muscle movement. So indirect pathway blocks muscle movement. So that's it for the basal ganglia.